As Roy said, I'm a groundwater guy, which in some ways means looking at and thinking about water resource governance and water resource management a little bit differently than people whose orientation towards water governance and management is often from a surface water perspective. I'll try to indicate the ways in which I think these things are different, as well as the obvious ways in which they're connected. As Roy mentioned, I'm a political scientist with an undergraduate economics background, which made him happy. And so my attention to water resources has really focused on the governing and managing of water resources, especially water supplies. And so I'm going to start off today just a brief discussion of governance and what I mean by that. A lot of other people mean similarly, and why it's important to think about. We're here at Waterloo, where there is a tremendous array of expertise and research in water science and water technology, all of which is crucial. The governance and management part is an important aspect of some of the faculty and students' research here too. As I say, that tends to be where I focus, as it says here. I think of the policy question, sometimes the management question is, what do we do about? And this is true in policy generally, not just in water. What should we do about crime, transportation, energy policy, water supply, et cetera? What should we do about? And that's kind of a policy question. The governance question is who gets to decide what we're going to do about, or sometimes I would say the political question is the difference between politics and policy. The policy question is what do we do about X, and the political question is who gets to decide what we're going to do about X, and how do we decide what we're going to do about X. And often you can't get to the answer to the policy question without having to pass through the governance question. That the who gets to decide part turns out to be really important in terms of what options are available, what options are on offer, and what's feasible and what can get done. Now you can, as this little parenthetical comment here indicates, you can create models that just sort of assume the governance problem away. Sort of assume a decision maker, and then the decision maker does stuff. But often that leaves some of the most interesting and most difficult parts of water governance and management to the side. I love this, this quotation. It's almost 30 years old now, but I still go back to it. Economist Dan Bromley wrote this, that water doesn't just show up at a farmer's field one day. There's all this governance stuff that happens to make that occur, including political maneuvering and rules about allocation and whether people comply with those rules and what do you do with people when they don't comply with those rules and all of that stuff. That even what looks from first appearance like a sort of a simple maybe irrigation system or something like that, Dan Bromley and others said has all of this other stuff behind it. So how did it get there? How did that happen? Who brought that about? And in the management of any water supply, that is to say, how it arrives and who gets it, for how long and in what quantities and all of that. Each of those management actions can be thought of as a rule. And one of Eleanor Ostrom's contributions to political economy was she and others thought about institutions as sets of rules. Doug North, others had similar areas of work over their lifetimes. And so in water, if you look at it from this political economy or institutional analysis perspective, every management action can be thought of as a rule. or can be thought of in terms as a rule. And the rule in a generic form would have this sort of who has to do what and when. Who may or who must or who must not do what things under what conditions. And those rules are the outputs of governance processes. So going back to the Bromley quote, water doesn't just appear at a farmer's field one day. There's all this stuff that happens. Well, this is the kind of stuff that happens, that people develop rules about who's going to do what and when and under what circumstances, and those rules are themselves the output of processes of governance. The things that we do in water governance, the things that people do in water governance, are things like these. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's meant to be a kind of representative list. You have to think about who's affected and how, and what is affected. If there are problems, what are they? Learning more about them, thinking about what might work to address them. And then if you're going to try to address those problems, how are you going to fund? How are you going to implement? How are you going to monitor? Adjust? If people, to go back to the Bromley quote, if people don't comply, what are you going to do about that? So sanctioning is often part of the governance puzzle around a water resource. Well, that's what, in a nutshell, governance does, but that just raises a whole other set of questions, which is, how do you set that up? How do you organize those governance processes? And so the governance processes will typically, especially in the developed world, involve some combination of public participation, some kind of stakeholder consultation processes. In the end, there's got to be some kind of authoritative decision-making arrangement. Somebody gets to say, we're going to do X, or we're going to do Y, or we're not going to do X, or we're not going to do Y. And then implementation and funding and so on. So these are all aspects of, or all part of organizing the governance of water resources. And at the water conference that the Institute presented last month, I put this list up, so those of you who were present there have seen this stuff in italics on this slide once before, but there's a lot of, it's no surprise that by now, and over at least a half century, there's a lot of literature, both advocacy literature, what should we do, and research literature, how are these things done in various places around the world. There's a lot of literature on organizing water governance and management. And out of that literature comes certain truth statements. We should organize water governance and management around the watershed. Unless you're a groundwater guy or gal, in which case your truth is we should organize groundwater management around the aquifer or groundwater basin. And another one of the truth statements that comes out of the literature on governance and management is we should manage surface water and groundwater together for all kinds of sensible reasons. More recently, especially in the context of urban systems, we should manage stormwater and wastewater together with the other water sources. Recognizing the importance of things like source water quality protection, we should manage source water supply protection and quality protection. We should manage water and land use together. And because of all of the ecological dimensions of water resources, that we should manage water resources and ecosystems together. So these are the truth statements that you will find, that I find certainly, throughout the literature on water governance and management. There's nothing wrong with any one of those statements. They all make sense. They're all sort of unassailably good statements. Attempting to do all of them is what proves to be challenging. So translating those truths into the actual governance and management of water resources is what has proved to be difficult. The truth statements are wrong. They just sometimes work in slightly different directions, and they don't always cohere as neatly as we would hope they would. Not least because sometimes the very physical contours of these different phenomena don't line up, or it's not clear how they line up. So, for instance, well, I guess the for instance is coming up on the next slide, but first I want to mention this. Okay, so if this is notes from underground. This is thinking about water from a groundwater perspective. So most of the blue stuff here, that's the stuff that I pay a lot of attention to, and so do a lot of colleagues. But a lot of the literature on governance and management in the past has had a kind of a surface water perspective. Catchments, watersheds, river basins. And as I mentioned, sometimes these things line up and sometimes these things don't. I've discovered in many conversations over the years with colleagues whose principal interest and focus has been surface water resources that they just sort of assume that the stuff under the ground follows the same boundaries as the stuff above the ground. Right? That there's a river basin, there's a watershed, there's a catchment, and if there's groundwater, well, it's sort of nested neatly within those things. And one of the things that changes in your perspective on the world when you become a groundwater person is that you suddenly realize that that's not always true. That where aquifers start and end and where a watershed starts and ends isn't always the same thing. It is, of course, the undeniable, fundamental truth of the hydrologic cycle that surface water and groundwater are interrelated. But we sometimes slide mentally from interrelated to identical. And I would make the case that interrelated and identical are not necessarily the same. Unassailably, unquestionably, undeniably, no one would want to deny it. Well, that's not true. There are lawyers. Groundwater and surface water are interrelated. But if we slide from that to sort of water is water is water is water is water, we sometimes run into sticking points and difficulties. We'll start with the boundary problem, but I've talked about the boundary problem before, and there's been a lot of attention to the boundary problem, so I'm going to do the boundary problem for maybe a few minutes and then move forward. But here's the boundary problem, and I already alluded to it. Like, here's southern Ontario, that's your rivers, that's your aquifers. All right. They're interrelated, they're not the same. If you're going to draw an institutional fence around your river basins, if you're going to draw an institutional fence around your aquifers, there's going to be places where those fences cross each other, intersect with each other. The aquifers are not neatly nested inside the surface water resource boundaries, despite the fact that when we look at a map, when we look at an aerial view of the Earth, it seems as though they ought to be. The underneath stuff ought to line up with the on the surface stuff. Sometimes it does. The boundary problem is important in governance. Fundamental, in fact. Because a crucial question, when you go, if we were to go back to those governance topics of participation and consultation and decision making and funding and implementation, fundamental to that governance stuff is the question of who's in and who's out. Who's inside the boundaries of the resource and who's not inside the boundaries of the resource. And one of the challenges in managing surface water and groundwater together is if the surface water boundaries and the groundwater boundaries are not the same, then that's a harder question to answer. The question of who's in and who's out is a harder question to answer. As well as the patterns of physical influence and effects. Whose actions are affecting the water, and in what ways. It looks like it ought to be a fairly straightforward question to answer. Sometimes it is a fairly straightforward question to answer. It isn't always a straightforward question to answer. So when we think about the boundaries of a governance system or a governance process for making decisions about water, this boundary thing is important. Like a lot of people, I've been influenced by our colleague Rob Below and his colleagues who talked about the fact that these decisions about who's in and who's out, they are at bottom political decisions. They're those questions about who gets to decide what we're going to do and how are we going to decide what we're going to do. Those governance questions that lie behind the management questions that lie behind the actions that we take when we want to use, protect, preserve water resources. And as soon, say this is a proud political sentence, as soon as you introduce the adjective political into the conversation, people's stomachs get squeezed. Nobody wants it to be political. Nobody wants it to be. Engineers don't want water stuff to be political. Geologists don't want water stuff to be political. Biologists don't want water stuff to be political. I think economists kind of go back and forth about whether they want water stuff to be political. But when you're coming down to those questions about what are we going to choose for the boundaries here, catchment, watershed, river basin, groundwater basin, when you come down to those choices, we don't get to just punt. As I've said before, we don't get to just let nature do the choosing for us, which is the way we usually want to elide that political question. You just go, well, you get your good topographical map there. There's your boundaries. That's who's in, that's who's out, done. And then, as I say, there's the groundwater problem. And if you're a groundwater person, as I am, this is how you get to become a little bit more skeptical about the sort of, well, let's just get the topographical map out and we'll figure out who's in and who's out, because the boundaries have been given to us by nature. We still end up choosing the boundaries. And when you're choosing the boundaries of your governance system, when you're choosing who's in, who's out, for purposes of decision making, that's a decision. When we would like to find a way out of the politics of it, geez, political, I don't want it to be political. I'll tell you what, I got the answer. We'll just design the governance processes so that they include, quote, all the affected interests. One of the great phrases of the natural resource management literature, not just water, but all kinds of other stuff too. Forests, fisheries, grazing lands, species, ecosystems, tell you what, we'll just design the governance process to include, quote, all the affected interests. Again, great, clear truth statement. Unless you invite an annoying visitor from Indiana who comes and says, what does it mean to have an interest in a water resource? What does it mean to be an affected interest? And how do we tell? Right? So some examples here. Do you have to live it? I mean, so we draw a physical boundary. You know, we draw a line on a map, and if you're inside the line, you're one of the affected interests, and if you're outside the line, you're not one of the affected interests. So everybody who's not in the Lake Erie drainage basin, just, there's the door, right? We're going to do Lake Erie stuff now. You don't live in the Lake Erie drainage basin? Adios. You can wait out in the lobby. We'll make the decisions about the Lake Erie drainage basin. Oh, sounds pretty interesting, although, in fact, it sounds pretty appealing, right? Should the people in Lake Erie be the decision makers about Lake Erie? And it's impossible to answer that question with anything but yes. But I have noticed with myself and with friends and with colleagues that we don't always answer the question the same way. Probably we pay more attention to this in the States because it involves Alaska, but there is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR as it's called. And for decades there has been debate about expanding oil and gas exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And here's the tricky part. As you might suspect from the name, darn few people live in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, although some do. And guess what? They are overwhelmingly in favor of expanding oil and gas exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The opposition to expanding oil and gas exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge largely comes from people who don't live in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I have never been to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I have no short-term plans to go to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I think it is likely that I will pass from this earth without ever actually getting to go to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I wouldn't mind if you're ever going and you've got room, you know, invite me. Think it's probably not going to happen. If I would have answered yes to the question, should Lake Erie decisions be made by the people in the Lake Erie drainage basin, would I also be willing then to say that the decisions about what happens in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge ought to be made by the people who live in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? And I have found very few of my friends and colleagues who are willing to be consistent, just even across those two cases. We talk about stakeholders, the language of stakeholders, stakeholder involvement, stakeholder consultation, stakeholder participation, stakeholder decision-making, etc. The language has been around for at least a half a century in the natural resource management field, including water. It's as benign as all the affected interests. a stakeholder. It's a stakeholder. If that's as far as the conversation goes, it's fine. I'm not here to spoil everybody's mind. If that's as far as the conversation goes, it's fine. I don't object to the word stakeholder or the word stakeholders or the idea that stakeholders should be consulted or participate. That's not my point. But I am curious about what it means to be a stakeholder. And from a governance standpoint, from that whole who participates in decision making and how point of view, are all stakeholders the same? And let me put this in a groundwater context, because again, that's the way I look at it. Worm's eye view. Our impulse, having grown up, whether you're Canadian or from the States, our impulse, having grown up in a democratic political culture, is, well, all stakeholders' voices should be counted equal. Stakeholders are stakeholders are stakeholders. Democracy, democracy, democracy. One person, one vote. Which is fine. Well, let's think about this a little bit. I'll think about it in groundwater context. As I understand it, and I'm not going to pretend to know much about the Grand River watershed except what I learned from the wonderful student presentations in the Water 602 group last month. As I understand it, most municipal water supply in Grand River watershed is groundwater. And most of the population in the Grand River watershed is served water from groundwater. And that means that I, a 6-week visitor, turning on my tap in my apartment, am a water user. In fact, I'm a groundwater user, odds are, in the Grand River watershed. So I get my stakeholder badge, and I'm a stakeholder, as I drink groundwater in Waterloo, Ontario. Now there's somebody else, maybe a couple miles away, who's sunk $10,000 into a well and pulls groundwater to irrigate a field. It's a groundwater user. And in the language of stakeholderdom, stakeholder. My voice, 6-week transient, occasional tap water drinker. That person's voice. Person with a literally and metaphorically sunk cost investment. Reliance on groundwater for his or her economic livelihood as well as personal health and hygiene. One person, one vote? Everybody the same? All stakeholders equal? And if not, you get to step out onto that slippery slope with me. If not, then how are we going to start weighting the affected interests? Some stakeholders count more than others. Who gets to decide that one? And how are we going to decide that? So, some of this language that we use, that as I said, for purposes of conversation, it's fine as far as it goes. But some of this language that we use, all the affected interests, stakeholders, so when you really start to dig into it and go, okay, what kind of decision-making processes do you want to have here? What kind of representation and voice should people have? How do you translate those voices and interests into decisions that sort of value those interests and voices in some way that you find appropriate? Then the sort of easy language doesn't look so easy. But the boundary issue is as I said earlier, the boundary issue is not the only difference between how the world works from a groundwater, how the world looks, I should say, from a groundwater perspective, and a surface water perspective. You look at surface water bodies, and you look at groundwater in aquifers, and lots of things can be different. Flow rates are the most obvious. Volume of water that takes a second to pass a point in a surface water body might take days or weeks to travel the same distance underground. So the flow rates, flow directions. Other things that end up mattering when it comes down to uses and users, like temperature. Folks in Northern California grow rice. Whether they should grow rice in California or not is a whole other question. But as a matter of fact, there are farmers in California who grow rice. And they use surface water. And if they substitute groundwater, because this has been experimented with and tried because we were trying to protect surface water flows by leaving the surface water in the stream, and if you have rice farmers substitute groundwater instead, 50-something degree Fahrenheit groundwater, not so good for the rice, turns out. The rice stalks develop a kind of technical term now, crud, on them. That is inconsistent with their healthy growth and later production. Mineral composition, microbial composition, obviously all different. Exposure to contamination, it's not that one type of water is exposed to contamination, the other isn't. It's clearly all able to be polluted, but the risks, the effects, and remediation very different. How these different, how water in these different manifestations responds to changing weather, including drought, differs. And I didn't put it on this slide, but the economics of surface water and groundwater are very different. Groundwater is typically, there are exceptions, especially in small communities, but typically, groundwater is a very distributed system. You have a well, I have a well, and our wells aren't necessarily linked to each other and so forth. And surface water, again, outside of very small communities where there might be a single source, a water tank or something like that. But surface water is typically a big sort of physical infrastructure investment with distribution pipes and pumps and all of that stuff. So the economics of surface water use, which can usually involve these huge capital outlays up front for a whole community, and then very low marginal costs for the next person to use the water, that looks a little different than a groundwater system where each individual user may have to make a capital investment in a well and a pump and pay the energy costs of lifting the water and things like that. So just sort of who pays and what does, what do the cost structures and benefits look like is a little bit different from surface water to groundwater. And then the sets of readily available uses differ. As I mentioned at the conference, if you're a groundwater person, your selection of photos is really limited, right? I appreciate your forbearance, in sitting here and looking at a photograph of like a well, you know, because that's, from an aquifer perspective, that's pretty much all you got, right? You have schematic drawings, you have diagrams of aquifers, usually little cross-sectional things like the thing I showed earlier. And you can go out and take a photograph of somebody's well. And that's pretty much your PowerPoint right there. You got wells and you got, you know, sort of cross-sectional diagrams, and that's about what you got. Whereas if you're a surface water person, God love you, you know, you've got lakes and you've got streams and you've got rapids and you've got waterfalls and you've got reservoirs and you've got oceans and you've got estuaries and you've got fish leaping out of them. It's awesome. You can just PowerPoint the daylights out of surface water. But it reflects the fact that the set of readily available uses is different. Right? Which also means, among other things, that people's attachments to these things are different too. Nobody ever says, oh yes, that was my mom's favorite aquifer. I remember when Dad taught me to fish, you know, from that groundwater basin. I mean, nobody does that, right? Nobody has a kind of an emotional attachment to a groundwater basin, unless, like, you've made a career out of writing about it, in which case I love them dearly, I must say, but that's personal. There we go. Another well. So what the governance issue comes down to is you're trying to govern and manage connected resources. Again, no denying. Surface water, groundwater interconnected? Absolutely. Absolutely. Hydrological cycle? True. But you're governing and managing interconnected resources that have differing characteristics. And so interconnected, as I said, that sort of slide to water is water is water is water. Sometimes you have to back up. And that's one of the reasons why translating the unity of the hydrologic cycle into integrated governance and management of surface and groundwater resources can be challenging. Because these things don't behave exactly the same. And some of the differences are important. One of the other reasons that integrated management has proved to be challenging, besides the boundary issue and who's in, who's out, who's a stakeholder and who isn't, all that stuff, which is important, is that water is a classic multifunctional resource. You can use it for lots of different things. And a very simple typology is there's surface water uses in the channel, surface water uses out of the channel, and those uses. So quick, we'll start with surface water in channel. You see what you can do with surface water? See, I mean, even a groundwater guy has to put surface water pictures in his PowerPoint sometimes, right? Because they're just so damn gorgeous. Some beautiful stuff. So let's start. We start with surface water in channel uses. You can use the flow for any of these things. You can use the flow for navigation, you can use the flow for waste conveyance, you can use the flow for baptisms and spiritual practices, you can use the flow for, obviously the flow has a critical role in meeting ecological needs for aquatic and riparian habitat. So a whole array of surface water uses. All that can be done with the water while it's still in whatever channel it's flowing in, stream, river, lake. And then there's the surface water out of channel uses, because we drag the water out of the river or the stream or the lake, and we do other stuff with it. So we use it for a variety of domestic uses, we use it for irrigation, use it for cooling, use it for manufacturing, even public safety. which turns out to be important. Can't let water pressure diminish beyond a certain point if you're relying on water for fire suppression. You do not want the firefighters to show up at the hydrant near your house and go, ah, sorry, bad day. We're a little low. So surface water out of channel uses, and then with groundwater you can do all of the out of channel uses of surface water, right? You drag the groundwater up to the surface. If you drag the groundwater up to the surface, then you can use it for all of those domestic uses, industrial uses, irrigation, etc. And another use of groundwater is storage, which turns out in water scarce areas to be one of the most valuable uses of groundwater. Groundwater is a place to bank the stuff. Aquifer, in addition to being a source of supply, is also a container, which is one of its most awesome and valuable properties. If you're in a heavily urbanized, highly economically developed, and yet also semi-arid or arid region, building new surface water reservoirs, if you even thought that was a good idea, building new surface water reservoirs is often just about out of the question. Buying up the land alone will not drive. Render the project infeasible. Put a new surface water reservoir in Southern California, good on you. Call me back when you get that sucker sited. I'm looking forward to that. Right? So if you're going to have a buffer against drought, your handy aquifer is also useful for storage. Now I'm going to put all this together. Here's the governance. This is just a different view of the governance challenge. When we talk about managing water together, when we talk about integrated governance and management of water resources, we're talking about all of that stuff. And that, as you saw, was pretty coarse-grained. I could have taken domestic uses and split it out into another half a dozen subcategories, and could have done the same in some of these other categories as well. So even at a fairly coarse-grained level, that's a lot. But okay, so it'd be complicated. We're smart. We're human beings. We climbed our way to the top of the food chain somehow. We can do this, but one of those. And then do this. Think about for each one of these, who are the stakeholders? Think about for each one of these, what are the values that are at stake? Economic, religious, health, etc. And the political scientist says, what do you think would happen if you did bundle those all together into a single decision? Which of those interests do you think is going to be right? Which of those interests do you think is going to be kind of left? I have my guesses, but my guesses are probably not any better than mine. But we can all look at that. You know what? I think I know what would happen. If you did have that sort of imaginary, comprehensive decision-making body, taking all of these into account, balancing all of these interests and uses. The crass, cynical political scientist says, we've been doing this. economics, but that was enough economics to teach me the word externalities. Yeah. Economics is good for lots of things, including getting terms that people use in a spot like this, and people go, ooh, externality. But yeah, I mean, some of those uses conflict with each other, and so you have to kind of reconcile that. Conflicts are going to occur across uses, across users, and then that raises a whole other bunch of questions, like do some of these uses have priority over others? And of course, from a governance standpoint, we always have to go back to the question before that, which is who gets to decide whether some of these uses have priorities over others? How do we decide that? On what basis do we decide that? Show of hands? Who brought more money to the table? Auction? I don't think the odds are on this guy. All right. So, what have we ended up with? Well, what we've ended up with is a reality, which we don't always like, which is that water governance turns out, not just here or in the States, but pretty much everywhere. Water governance turns out to be complex, and it turns out typically to be polycentric. Lots of decision-making bodies with their finger in the pie. Some of that is because of water. All of those interesting little things about water that we've already covered, but some of it is because of us. Think about just the challenge of trying to govern and manage all of that as a level. Human beings, God love us, are neither as smart as we think we are or as dumb as we sometimes are. Have our limits. And given the limits on human information processing capabilities, what people often do, not just in the world of water, but in general, is they do what Herbert Simon called decomposing. Decompose even things that are interrelated into more nearly tractable components, subparts, etc. This is a very well-known quote, often repeated from a management consultant, theorist Peter Drucker, who said institutions can't survive if you put them together in such a way that you need geniuses to run them. Have to compose organizations in such a way that average human beings can do it. So, when we recognize the interrelations in water management, surface water, groundwater, all the uses, all of the ways in which they're interconnected, that's important. That's important. We don't get real far unless we get to that realization. But then when we try to go the next step and say, let's govern and manage all of this stuff together, that gets hard for all of the reasons. Shouldn't necessarily expect people to combine all of this stuff together into one decision-making body. And so the focus for the future should probably be less on the dream of organizational integration and more on the prospects, more realistic prospects, I would argue, of inter-organizational coordination. You might end up with different bodies who are looking after the ecological values and the navigation status and the surface water and the groundwater and all of that stuff. You might end up with different bodies, and what's going to be crucial is coordination. And that may be more tractable, that may be more realistic for bounded human beings to try to pull off when it comes to managing and governing our resources
questions? Anyone? Ross?
Thanks, Bill. I really enjoyed that. It sounds like, though, to be a bit cynical, it sounds like you're arguing for the status quo, right? In the sense of, you know, you should stop trying so hard to find new organizations, just go with what you got and spend more time trying to make things work together at the edges, and reducing obvious conflicts between what people are doing, but just, you know, carry on as if we are. Right? Am I misinterpreting that, or?
Only a little. Rather than a defense of the status quo, it's, as you said, it's more about where does reasonable progress lie. The status quo is not something I would want to defend. But as your question suggested, whether you think about it as at the edges or not, there's a lot that can be done in improving coordination. And so, you know, sort of looking at this from a pragmatic perspective, you know, where would I put my time and effort, either as a researcher or as a practitioner? Where would I put my time and effort? Would I put my time and effort into trying to reform organizations to make individual organizations more comprehensive? Or would I put my time and effort into building bridges and increasing information sharing, collaboration, shared decision-making, you know, and those sort of mechanisms of organizational coordination? And I'm saying that from a pragmatic perspective, I put my time and effort there. Because I'm a little bit, not just cynical, but concerned that the organizational integration thing is kind of ephemeral, that will never really pull off. And in the meantime, there's a hell of a lot that needs to be done. And probably get at it better by working across organizations.
Questions?
Quick question, Neil. Very nice presentation, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
See, the Great Lakes Basin has a lot of water, and of course, the southwestern United States are lucky to get at it. You know, every time a little drop gets out of that basin, the people around the Great Lakes Basin get quite excited.
Yes.
What is the lineup between, let's say, the drainage basins and the aquifers around the Chicago area, for example?
Well, it's one of the most fun things, I think, because the folks in the Chicago area and the folks in Illinois, if you're already familiar with this history, bear with me while I repeat it briefly. About 115 years ago, reversed the flow of the Calumet, I think it was, so that it would convey water from Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, which drains to the Mississippi. And even the Great Lakes Basin Compact, as I understand it, although we have a practitioner in our midst who will, I hope, correct me if I get this wrong, even the Great Lakes Basin Compact that sort of drew a contour around the basin as a whole for all 5 lakes and prohibited export, sort of grandfathered that in. Is that accurate? I mean, there was nobody said, hey, Chicago, you got to turn around and stop taking water out of Lake Michigan and running it all the way down to the Mississippi River and out to the Gulf of Mexico. So, you know, we didn't undo that. So often the case in policy and institutions generally is, you know, sort of history starts when, you know, and so in this case, you know, the diversions away from the lakes that were already in place, I think were left in place, and we weren't going to try and go back to 1900 and redo. But the whole question that you raise is so fascinating because it goes back to this boundary issue of who's in and who's out. You know, in the Southwest United States, as you referenced, we've dragged water a couple of 100 miles, right, from the Colorado River to Los Angeles and San Diego, from the Northern California all the way down through the Central Valley and on over the mountains into Southern California as well. We've dragged, and it raises for me. So what does that river basin look like? You know, is LA in the Colorado River basin? No, because 100 years ago they built a big straw. You know, is 2 Tucson, Arizona in the Colorado River Basin now, because the Central Arizona Project runs water all the way through. Again, you know, it's the difference between sort of the topographical map view of the world and the view of the world that as human action has actually transformed it sometimes. And are we going to try to unwind all of those transformations? Get back to nature. Sounds good. I like it. Bumper sticker. Ready. Or do you sort of take the circumstances that you're in and go, all right, so here we are. In the case of the Great Lakes, talking to a Midwest guy, right, I'm from the States, I've done a lot of my work in California, now I'm living there. Those people better keep their mitts off of our fine freshwater. That's right. See, we all have our tipping points. That's thank you.
How do you see the role of water markets?
Water markets are enormously important. The one challenge I find with water markets is that in some of our theorizing and modeling about water markets, we tend to do the water is water is water is water. And we tend to think in terms of sort of using water markets and transfers and trading to resolve reciprocal externalities. You have a farm, I have a farm, you use water, I use water, you know, and I'm willing to pay more than you are, so you transfer water to me, right? Brilliant, works. I mean, it's made a huge difference in places like the Darling, it's made a huge difference in places in Southern California, it's made a huge difference in lots of places around the world in terms of easing some of those conflicts over allocation. It's not as clear to me how readily it resolves non-reciprocal externalities. You know, you want the water for farming and I want the water for baptism, and you know, so what do we do then? And it also, it assumes property rights, of course, and property rights in water are often given by more than one jurisdiction. So in addition to the transaction issue of you and me as two water users deciding whether to transfer water or not, there's also often added complication that your right to the water traces to a source of law that's different from my right to the water traces from. And typically in modeling and theorizing for perfectly understandable reasons, we sort of, sort of assume a set of property rights, you know, that are fungible, and then model out what transfers will do. Well, within the context of when rights are fungible, water transfers and water markets do awesome, awesome things. So they have a role to play. There's other things where it's going to be a much tougher lift to use markets to resolve some of the other, especially the sort of non-reciprocal conflicts.
One more question.
You said coordination might be more plausible and maybe the way to go when compared to an actual integration of. But even with coordination, we might be starting with a not the same balance of power among stakeholders. So is there any, not necessarily guarantee, but any approach that might mitigate against the effects of the balance of power while creating those coordinated mechanisms?
I'm glad that you asked. Two things real quick, as I realize we're out of time. First, you're absolutely right. The power imbalances will be there across organizations, just as the power imbalances will be there within an organization. From a politics perspective, I take the unwelcome perspective that not all conflict is bad, and having organizations that can stand up for themselves, having contestation over differences of uses and values may in some ways be more beneficial for the less powerful than if there's just sort of put in a blender with everybody else and you know, votes and dollars end up deciding things. So I'm willing to leave some room for the idea that there might be organizations around different uses, interests, and values, and the very fact that they're separate organizations, perhaps with their own legal or status, so that you can't necessarily just one can't necessarily or as easily bulldoze the other, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And if the outcome is some conflict, but that conflict arises from differences in interest values, that's not all bad. And then the other thing is that it is rare, except at the global level, that at the global scale, that these things take place without some overarching set of rules, laws, and institutions. And so it's not a panacea, it's not a remedy for everything, but the fact that you might have inter-organizational conflict as well as inter-organizational coordination taking place in a context where there are also laws, courts, protections for rights and liberties, and things like that, that helps a little bit. Fundamental premise of your question is unassailable, though. There are power imbalances. There will probably always be power imbalances. I don't think they go away if you put everybody inside the same, if you put everybody under the same roof. And they don't go away if you have people under separate roofs either. And what you're going to need is to have these organizations nested within an overarching framework of laws, rules, and institutions that can at least provide some opportunity for conflict resolution, conflict mediation.
Let's give Bill one more